Blood dripped from the Alpha King's sword, pooling on the marble floor of the conquered throne room. Around him, treacherous lords trembled in the shadows, waiting for the ruthless warlord to claim his iron seat. Instead, John let his weapon fall. The heavy steel clattered against the stone. He turned his back on the ultimate power and walked toward a fragile orphan shivering in a patched shawl. The most dangerous man alive dropped to one massive knee before her. A single tear, the first he had shed in 100 years, cut through the ash on his scarred face. He held out the golden crown, his voice breaking the silence. "The last time I cried, I was someone else," he whispered. The winter wind howled through the cracked timber of the isolated hovel. Mary wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shivering shoulders. The fire in the stone hearth had died down to a handful of gray ashes. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a familiar pain she had endured for 3 days. Outside, the snow fell thick and heavy, burying the forgotten medieval village in white. A sudden, heavy thud against the wooden door broke the silence of the night. Mary froze, holding her breath as she listened intently. Only the groaning of the trees answered her. She forced her stiff legs to move and approached the door with caution. When she pulled it open, the freezing wind bit into her face. A large shape lay collapsed across the threshold, face down in the deep drift. Mary gasped and knelt beside the motionless figure. She cleared the snow away from his face and saw a man covered in frozen blood. His dark hair was matted with ice, and his breathing was shallow. He wore ruined leather armor that bore the crest of a fallen sovereign. Mary did not know this was John, the absolute ruler whom men called the Alpha King. She only saw a human being on the verge of death. With all the strength left in her frail body, Mary gripped his heavy shoulders. She dragged him across the floor, her muscles screaming from the exertion. The door shut out the storm with a dull slam. John groaned as Mary managed to roll him onto her meager straw mattress. His skin felt as cold as the ice outside. Mary ran to her small wooden chest and pulled out her only spare blanket. It was coarse and patched, but she spread it gently over his broad chest. She went back to the hearth and blew on the remaining embers. She threw her last 2 pieces of firewood into the ashes. The small flames flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the small room. Mary fetched a cup of stale water and her final piece of hard barley bread. She sat on the dirt floor beside the stranger, watching his pale face. John shifted restlessly, his hand twitching toward a missing sword hilt. A deep scar ran along his jawline, a testament to violent battles. Mary dipped a corner of her shawl into the water and wiped the grime from his brow. He flinched at the touch, but did not wake. Hours passed as the small fire fought against the winter chill. Mary watched over him, ignoring her own exhaustion and the cold that seeped through her boots. The storm outside seemed to grow more furious, rattling the loose roof tiles. Near dawn, John stirred with a sharp, violent gasp. His dark eyes snapped open, filled with a sudden and terrifying wildness. Before Mary could move, his large hand shot out and clamped around her throat. He pinned her to the floor with a strength that defied his injuries. Mary could not breathe, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at him. "Who sent you?" John demanded, his voice a low, gravelly growl. He looked around the miserable room, his eyes scanning for hidden assassins. His chest heaved, and fresh blood began to seep through his torn bandages. Mary could only shake her head, her hands clutching at his iron wrist. She managed to point to the cup of water on the floor. John looked down at the water, then at her pale, frightened face. He noticed her thin clothes and her robes showing beneath her smock. Slowly, his fingers loosened, and he released her. Mary collapsed on the floor, coughing and drawing in deep breaths of air. John sank back onto the straw mattress, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. "You are a peasant," he muttered, his gaze turning to the ceiling. "I am Mary," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "You should have left me in the snow to die, Mary," he said. "The wolves would have torn you apart before morning," she replied simply. John let out a dry, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Perhaps that would have been a better fate than betrayal," he said. Mary crawled back over and picked up the wooden cup. She held it out to him with steady hands. "Drink," Mary said. "It is all I have, but it is clean." John stared at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of deceit. He saw only honesty and a profound sadness in her eyes. He took the cup and drank the water in grody gulps. When he finished, Mary offered him the piece of hard bread. "Eat this," she said, though her own stomach chose that moment to rumble loudly. John looked at the small piece of bread, then looked at her hollow cheeks. "This is your last food," he stated, his voice softening slightly. "You need it more than I do," Mary said, pushing the bread into his hand. "I am a stranger who almost killed you," John said, staring at the bread. "You are a man who was freezing to death," Mary replied. John broke the bread in half and held out the larger piece to her. "We share," he said, leaving no room for argument. Mary hesitated, then took the piece and ate it gratefully. For a few minutes, the only sound was the howling wind outside. John watched her eat, marveling at her lack of fear now that the initial shock had passed. He had spent his entire life surrounded by nobles who flattered him for power. He had been betrayed by his closest generals for a crown. Yet, here, in a broken shack, a starving woman was keeping him alive. "What happened to you?" Mary asked softly, looking at his wounds. "Mary, who called me king, decided they wanted the throne," John said coldly. "They struck from the shadows like cowards." "Are you safe here?" Mary asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "No one looks for a king in the ruins of the borderlands," John said. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain made him hiss through his teeth. "Do not move," Mary commanded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. John stopped, surprised that he was obeying a peasant girl. "I will fetch more water from the well when the storm calms," she said. She stood up and walked to the window, peering through the cracks. The sky was a dull gray, and the snow was finally beginning to slow. John closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the small fire on his skin. He realized he could not remember the last time someone had helped him without asking for gold. The crown on his head had always felt like a burden of iron. In this miserable hovel, without his sword or his army, he felt a strange sense of peace. He looked at Mary, who was now gathering the remaining scraps of wood to keep the fire going. She was fragile, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity. "Thank you, Mary," John said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Mary turned and gave him a small, tired smile. "Rest now, sir," she said. John let his head fall back onto the straw, his eyes growing heavy. For the first time in many years, he fell into a sleep that was not plagued by nightmares of war. Mary sat by the fire, watching the stranger sleep as the storm finally passed. Morning light pierced the cracks of the wooden walls. Dust danced in the pale beams that fell across the cold dirt floor. John opened his eyes and reached instinctively for a weapon that was not there. His side burned with a dull ache, but the bleeding had finally stopped during the night. He pushed himself up from the straw mattress and surveyed the empty room. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers in the stone hearth. Mary was nowhere to be seen. John stood up slowly, testing the strength in his battered legs. He walked toward the small wooden table in the corner of the hut. A single dull knife and a chipped wooden bowl sat upon the rough surface. He opened the wooden cabinet and found only dust inside. There were no hidden supplies, no stored grain, and no winter clothes. He realized Mary lived on the absolute edge of starvation. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in a sudden blast of freezing air. Mary stepped inside, her face pale and her lips tinged with blue. She carried a heavy wooden bucket of water and a handful of dried roots. Snow clung to her thin shawl and her worn leather boots. She shut the door quickly and hurried toward the hearth. John watched her kneeling by the ashes to coax the fire back to life. "You should not have got out in this cold," John said. Mary jumped slightly at the sudden sound of his voice. She turned her head and offered him a weak, tired smile. "We need water, and I found some willow bark for your fever," she replied. She poured the water into a small iron pot and hung it over the growing flames. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them together for warmth. John crossed the room and took her freezing hands in his large palms. Mary stared up to him, surprised by the unexpected contact. His hands were rough with calluses from years of holding a sword, yet they radiated a comforting heat. "You will catch your death out there in the snow," John told her. "I have survived many winters alone," Laurie said gently. She pulled her hands away, stepping back to check the boiling water. John leaned against the stone wall and watched her work. She crotched the dried willow bark with the heavy handle of her knife. The bitter smell of the medicine filled the cramped space. "Why do you leave so far from the village?" John asked. Mary kept her eyes focused on the iron pot. "The villagers do not welcome orphans," she answered. "They believe bad luck follows those without a family to claim them." John frowned, feeling a strange tightening in his chest. He had enrolled billions of subjects, yet he knew nothing of their daily suffering. "They are fools," John said simply. Mary scooped dark liquid into the wooden bowl and brought it over to him. "Drink this while it is hot," she instructed. John took the bowl and swallowed the bitter medicine without flinching. He sat back down on the straw mattress and let her examine his bandages. Mary carefully unwrapped the bloody cloth from his waist. The sword cut was deep, but no infection had set in overnight. She washed the wound with warm water and applied a thick paste made from the roots. Her touch was remarkably gentle, pulling no pain from his torn flesh. "You have a healer's hands, Mary," John noted. "Pain is a common friend in the borderlands," Mary whispered. "I learn how to mend things out of necessity." She tied a clean strip of linen tightly around his torso. Before John could respond, a sharp sound cut through the quiet winter morning. A distant horn echoed down from the snowy mountain ridge. John went rigid, his instincts flaring instantly. He knew that specific sound intimately. It was the hunting horn used by his traitorous generals. Mary stood up, alarm widening her brown eyes. "What is that?" she asked, looking nervously toward the window. "Men who want my head," John said, forcing himself to stand. He grabbed the dull knife from the table, his muscles tensing for a fight. He would not let these assassins harm the woman who had saved him. "They are searching the valley," John said, moving steadily toward the door. Mary ran forward and grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You cannot fight them in this state," she pleaded. "I will not hide while they burn this place to the ground," John retorted. "They do not know you are here," Mary insisted, pulling him backward. She dragged him toward a section of loose floorboards near the hearth. She pried the heavy planks up to reveal a small, dark root cellar. "Get inside," Mary commanded, with an unexpected authority. John looked down into the dark hole, then back at her determined face. "If they find you hiding me, they will execute you," John warned. "They will only see a poor peasant girl," Mary said, pushing his solid shoulder. "Please, John." It was the very first time she had spoken his name.
The sound of it on her lips broke through his stubborn pride. John lowered himself into the freezing cellar, his large frame barely fitting in the tight space. Mary handed him the ragged blanket before sliding the heavy floorboards back into place. Darkness swallowed him completely. Above him, John heard Mary drag the heavy wooden chest over the loose boards to hide the seams. He sat in the pitch black, gripping the dull knife in his hand. The sound of horses tramping through the deep snow grew louder outside. Heavy fists hammered on the wooden door, shaking the entire frame of the hovel. John held his breath, listening to the muffled voices through the floor. He heard the door smash open and the heavy boots of soldiers storming inside. Snow blew into the room, chilling the floorboards right above his head. "Where is he, girl?" a rough voice demanded. "We tracked his blood to the edge of these woods," Mary's voice answered, high and trembling with feigned terror. "I have seen no one, my lord. I have not left this hut since the storm began 2 days ago." "Do not play games with us," another soldier barked angrily. The sickening sound of pottery shattering echoed through the small room. John clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white around the knife handle. He listened helplessly as the men tore apart her meager belongings. They flipped the straw mattress and kicked the wooden table hard against the wall. "She has nothing here, Captain," a soldier finally said. "Just another starving rat in the woods." "Leave her," the captain ordered in a bored tone. "If you see a wounded man, report to the garrison immediately, or we will hang you from the nearest tree." "Yes, my lord," Mari whispered. The heavy boots marched back out and the broken door slammed shut. John listened to the heavy horses gallop away until silence finally returned to the valley. The wooden chest scraped across the floor above him. Light poured into the cellar as Mary pulled the floorboards away. She reached down to help him out of the tight space. John climbed out of the hole and looked at the senseless destruction around them. Her only iron pot was heavily dented, and the wooden bowl was crushed to splinters. Mary did not cry, but she stood quietly amid the ruin of her life. She bent down and began to pick up the broken pieces of wood. John walked over to her, his heart suddenly heavier than the crown he had lost. He stopped her hands from gathering the ruined herbs from the dirt floor. John gently pulled her up to face him. He reached out and carefully brushed a stray lock of hair from her pale face. "You risked your life for a man you do not even know," John said. "I could not let them take you," Mary replied quietly, looking up at him. "I swear to you, Mary," John said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vow. "I will repay you for every broken thing in this room."
Mary looked at his intense eyes and slowly shook her head. "I am just glad you are safe," she replied. John pulled her into his broad chest, wrapping his arms securely around her trembling shoulders. He closed his eyes and buried his face in her hair. The Alpha King realized his entire kingdom meant nothing compared to the brave woman holding him now. The soldiers left behind a profound silence that was broken only by the crackling fire. John released Mary from his embrace and looked at the ruined hut. He knelt on the dirt floor and began to gather the splintered remains of the wooden table. Mary watched him in quiet astonishment. Kings did not clean up broken wood. "You should rest, John," she said, kneeling beside him. "My wounds are healing, Mary," he replied without looking up. "I will not sit idle while you suffer the consequences of my enemies." They worked side by side to stack the broken planks near the hearth for firewood. The destruction had taken what little Mary owned, but it had also shattered the invisible wall between them. 3 days passed in a slow, starving rhythm. The winter storm finally broke, leaving the valley buried beneath a sea of white. John's strength returned quickly, fueled by a stubborn will to survive. He spent his mornings repairing the heavy door and patching the gaps in the timber walls. He used strips of leather from his ruined armor to bind the broken chair legs. Mary watched his capable hands work with a quiet fascination. She had expected arrogance from a man who carried himself like a ruler. Instead, she found a man who chopped firewood with fierce concentration and fixed her home without complaint. Yet, a darker shadow loomed over their fragile peace. The food was entirely gone. Mary boiled pine needles and melted snow to stave off the gnawing ache in their stomachs. She always poured the thicker broth into his wooden cup. John knew she was starving herself to ensure he regained his strength. He tried to refuse the extra portion, but she would simply walk away until he finished it. "You need it to heal," she would say with finality. John had never felt such helpless frustration. He possessed the knowledge to command armies and conquer cities. Here, he could not even provide a piece of bread for the woman who saved his life. On the fourth afternoon, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Mary took the heavy bucket and stepped outside to gather more snow from the drifts. John sat by the fire, sharpening the dull kitchen knife against a smooth river stone. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the small room. 10 minutes passed, and the door remained closed. John stopped his work and listened. He heard only the distant wind whistling through the bare branches. A sudden spike of dread pierced his chest. He dropped the stone and strode quickly to the door. When he pulled it open, the bitter cold rushed in to greet him. Mary lay motionless in the snow a few yards from the threshold. The heavy bucket had spilled, scattering loose ice around her pale hands. "Mary!" John shouted, ignoring the sharp pain that flared in his side. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside her. Her skin was terrifyingly white, and her lips were cracked and dry. She had simply collapsed from extreme exhaustion and starvation. John slipped his arms beneath her frail body and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside and gently laid her down on the straw mattress. He dragged his own patched blanket over her and tucked it tightly around her shivering shoulders. John stoked the fire until the flames roared, casting bright light across her still face. He rubbed her freezing hands between his own, trying to force warmth back into her blood. "Wake up, Mary," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a heavy emotion. Mary did not stir, her breathing terribly shallow. John looked at her hollow cheeks and felt a sudden, violent surge of anger. He was not angry at his traitors, nor at the cruel winter. He was furious with himself. He had allowed her to sacrifice her life for his. John gently placed her hands under the blanket and stood up. He walked to the table and picked up the sharpened knife. He tested the edge against his thumb, watching a small drop of blood bead on his skin. It was a pathetic weapon for a king, but it would have to do. He looked back at Mary, making a silent vow in the quiet room. He would not let her die in this forsaken place. John buttoned his ruined leather tunic and wrapped a scrap of cloth around his neck. He stepped out of the hovel and pulled the door shut behind him. The forest stood before him like a dark, imposing wall. He had hunted boar with golden spears and a dozen hounds in his past life. Now, he was just a desperate man hunting for survival. John moved into the tree line, his steps silent despite the deep snow. His sharp eyes scanned the white landscape for any sign of movement. He tracked a set of small prints that led toward a dense thicket of thorns. The cold bit at his face, but the fire burning in his chest kept him moving forward. He crouched low behind a fallen oak tree and waited. Patience was a virtue he had learned on bloody battlefields. A large winter hare emerged from the bushes, sniffing the freezing air. John tightened his grip on the knife handle. He calculated the distance and the speed of the wind in a split second. He sprang forward with lethal grace, crossing the distance before the animal could turn. The hunt was over in a single, brutal motion.
John stood up, breathing heavily as he looked down at his prize. It was a small victory, but it meant they would live another day. He tied the hare to his belt and turned back toward the distant smoke of the chimney. The return journey felt twice as long as the adrenaline faded from his blood. His wound pulsed with a dull warning, but he ignored it. When he reached the clearing, he saw the small hut standing resilient against the snow. He pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth. Mary turned her head weakly on the mattress, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him standing there, covered in snow, holding fresh meat in his hand. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks. John walked over and knelt beside the mattress. "You will not go hungry again, Mary," John said softly. "I promise you." He stood up and went to the hearth to prepare the meal. Mary watched his broad back, feeling a strange sense of safety wash over her. He was a dangerous man, but he was choosing to use his strength for her. The smell of roasting meat soon filled the small room, masking the scent of cold and despair. John brought her a wooden bowl filled with rich, hot broth and tender meat. He sat beside her and fed her slowly, making sure she did not eat too fast. Mary swallowed the warm food, feeling life slowly return to her freezing limbs. She looked at John, seeing the fierce determination in his dark eyes. He was no longer just a wounded stranger seeking refuge. He was becoming her protector. The harsh winter tightened its grip on the borderlands. Inside the small hut, a strange domestic rhythm took root. John insisted on doing all the heavy labor. He chopped the remaining firewood and hunted in the nearby woods every dawn. Mary regained her strength under his silent care. Color returned to her cheeks, and her movements lost their previous frailty. She spent her days mending his torn leather tunic with a bone needle. They spoke little during the daylight hours. Their shared silence was comfortable and heavy with unspoken gratitude. John spent his evenings sitting by the fire with a piece of hard pine. He used his hunting knife to carve the wood with steady, precise strokes. Mary watched his focused expression from across the room. She wondered what a man of his stature was making with such care. On the 7th night, John finished his work. He brushed the wood shavings from his trousers and stood up. He walked over to Mary and held out his large hand. A finely carved wooden comb rested in his palm. Mary stared at the object in surprise. "You lost yours when the soldiers tore this place apart," John said. He did not wait for her to accept it. He gently placed the comb into her lap and stepped back. Mary traced the smooth teeth of the comb with trembling fingers. She had never received a gift in her entire life. The orphans in the borderlands were taught to expect nothing but hardship. "You spent hours on this," Mary said softly. "Wood is easier to shape than a kingdom," John replied quietly. "It requires only patience and a steady hand." Mary looked at the large hands that had crafted such a delicate thing. She knew those hands were built for war, yet they moved with immense gentleness around her. "Thank you, John," she whispered. John merely nodded and returned to his spot near the hearth. The fire cast long, dancing shadows against the timber walls. "It is time to change your bandages," Mary said, setting the comb aside. John pulled his tunic over his head without a word. His chest and back were a canvas of violent history. Silver scars crossed over jagged burns and deep puncture wounds. Mary brought the bowl of warm water and knelt beside him. She washed the healing cut on his side with practiced efficiency. Her eyes lingered on a particularly brutal scar over his heart. "Who did this to you?" Mary asked softly. She touched the edge of the scar with a damp cloth. John tensed at the contact, his muscles bunching under his skin. "My own brother," John answered. His voice held a flat, terrifying calm.
Mary stopped washing the wound and looked up at his face. John stared into the flames, his eyes reflecting the deep orange light. He wanted my command, so he drove a dagger into my chest while I slept. I survived, and I ended his life the very next day. John waited for Mary to pull away in disgust. He expected to see fear in her eyes, now that she knew his true nature. He was a killer who had slaughtered his own blood. Instead, Mary gently pressed the warm cloth back against his skin. "You must have felt so alone," Mary said. John turned his head, genuinely shocked by her response. He searched her expression for pity or horror. He found only deep sorrow and an unexpected understanding. "They taught me that mercy was a weakness," John told her. "They taught me to rule with fear and steel." "Did it make you happy?" Mary asked. "It kept me alive," John replied. He looked down at her hands resting gently against his chest. "My enemies expected me to be a monster, so I became one. I built an empire on corpses, Mary. My past is a long road of blood and ash." "You are not that mad in this room," Mary said firmly. She tied the fresh linen bandage securely around his torso. "A monster would have taken my food and left me to starve. A monster would not carve a comb for a woman who has nothing." John reached out and caught her wrist before she could move away. His grip was strong but careful. "I would burn that empire to the ground to keep you safe," John said. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They hung in the quiet room heavy with absolute truth. Mary felt her pulse quicken under his warm fingers. She did not pull her hand away. She saw the immense vulnerability hiding behind his fierce gaze. The man before her was not a cruel warlord. He was a broken soul who had finally found a safe harbor. John slowly released her wrist, letting his hand drop to his side. He lay back on the straw mattress and stared at the dark ceiling. Mary returned to her side of the fire and pulled her shawl tight. Neither of them slept well that night. The air between them crackled with a new, undeniable tension. Morning broke with a pale, cold light. John stood by the window watching the horizon. He felt stronger than he had in weeks. The wound on his side barely ached. Mary prepared a simple meal of dried meat and melted snow. She noticed the rigid posture of his broad shoulders. "What do you see?" Mary asked, walking over to join him. John pointed toward the distant line of the mountains. A thick pillar of black smoke rose into the gray sky. It was coming from the direction of the nearby village. "They are burning the houses," John said grimly. "The soldiers?" Mary asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They have lost my trail, so they are punishing the innocent." John turned away from the window and walked to the table. He picked up the sharpened kitchen knife. It was a meager tool against armored men. "You cannot go there," Mary said, stepping in front of him. "They will slaughter the entire village if they find nothing," John replied. "They will slaughter you," Mary countered, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I am not the helpless man you dragged out of the snow, Mary." John placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I brought this ruin to your lands. I must end it." Mary looked at the determined set of his jaw. She knew she could not stop him. "Then I will go with you," Mary said. John shook his head immediately. "It is too dangerous." "I know the hidden paths through the woods," Mary insisted. "You will be blind without me." John stared at her, weighing the tactical advantage against the risk to her life. He hated the idea of putting her in danger. He also knew she spoke the truth. "You stay behind me at all times," John commanded. Mary nodded, her fear entirely replaced by resolve. She grabbed her worn boots and her thickest woolen shawl. John watched her prepare,
a profound respect swelling in his chest. She had no armor and no weapon. She only had immense courage. John pushed the heavy door open, and they stepped out into the bitter cold. The wind immediately tore at their clothes. Mary led the way toward the dense tree line. She moved with practiced silence over the deep snowdrifts. John followed closely, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Every snapped twig made his muscles tense. He was ready to kill anyone who threatened the woman walking before him. The smoke grew thicker as they navigated the winding forest path. The smell of burning pine and ash filled the freezing air. Mary did not falter, even as the danger drew near. John realized that he had found a pain in the ruins of the world. Black smoke choked the winter sky above the valley. Flames roared through the thatched roofs of the border village. Mary crouched behind a snow-covered boulder at the edge of the woods. John knelt closely beside her. His broad body shielded her entirely from the freezing wind. They observed the chaotic square through a gap in the barren bushes. A dozen armored soldiers had herded the terrified villagers into the center of the muddy plaza. Men and women huddled together in the freezing slush.
These were the same people who had driven Mary away with stones. They looked pathetic and small beneath the drawn swords of the traitors. A tall captain in dark armor paced before the trembling crowd. He held a burning torch in his right hand. "Your silence buys you nothing but ashes," the captain announced. His harsh voice echoed against the burning walls. "The sovereign king passed through this valley days ago. Give us his location, or burn with your miserable homes." An old man stepped forward on shaking legs. "We know nothing of kings or wars," the elder pleaded. The captain struck the old man down with a brutal blow. Mary gasped sharply and buried her face against John's shoulder. A dangerous rumble vibrated deep within John's chest. He gently pushed Mary behind the heavy boulder. "Do not move from this spot," he instructed her. Mary grabbed his sleeve with freezing fingers. "They have armor and steel," she whispered urgently. John looked down at the rusty knife in his hand. "Steel is only as strong as the man who wields it," he replied. He stood up and stepped out of the protective shadows. The snow seemed to silence his heavy footsteps. John walked toward the village square with a predatory grace. He did not rush or shout a loud battle cry. His sheer presence carried the crushing weight of a true ruler. A soldier guarding the perimeter turned and spotted the solitary figure. "Halt!" the guard shouted, raising a heavy crossbow. John did not slow his steady pace. He moved his head a fraction of an inch as the bolt flew past his ear. Before the soldier could reload, John closed the distance. He drove his rusty knife upward through the vulnerable gap beneath the guard's chin. The man collapsed silently into the red snow. John caught the falling crossbow and aimed it toward the plaza in one fluid motion. He fired the heavy weapon into the back of another guard. The sharp crack of the mechanism finally drew the attention of the captain. The armored leader turned, his eyes widening in sudden recognition. "The king!" the captain roared, drawing his broadsword. "Kill him and claim the gold!" 10 armed men rushed forward with weapons raised. John met their charge like an immovable mountain. He grabbed a discarded longsword from the snowy ground. The familiar weight of the weapon felt like an extension of his own arm. He parried the first aggressive strike with a deafening clash of metal. His counterattack was a blur of lethal speed. He shattered the nearest attacker's defense with a devastating overhead strike. The force sent the soldier crashing backward into the mud. John moved through the enemy ranks like a dark tempest. He did not fight with desperation or fear. He fought with the cold fury of a betrayed sovereign. Blades flashed in the firelight, but none could touch him. He blocked a spear thrust with the flat of his sword. He spun and drove his elbow into the attacker's chest. The soldier gasped and crumpled into the snow. Another guard swung a heavy warhammer toward his head. John ducked beneath the fatal arc. He swept the man's legs out from under him. The fight was a brutal display of martial perfection. He disarmed a third man with a sharp twist of his wrist. A heavy kick sent another flying into a burning cart. Mary watched his broad back through the barren branches. She saw the absolute devotion in his lethal movements. He was destroying a dozen armed men to ensure her safety. Her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. She felt no fear toward the violent protector in the square. The villagers watched the violent spectacle in stunned silence. They could not comprehend the overwhelming power of the solitary warrior. Only the tall captain remained standing. He backed away, his initial arrogance replaced by stark terror. "You are a dead man," the captain stammered. "My armies hold the capital." John advanced slowly, his dark eyes fixed on the traitor. "They hold a chair of wood and iron," John corrected softly. "They do not hold the power." The captain lunged forward in a desperate attack. John sidestepped the heavy thrust with effortless grace. He brought the pommel of his sword down hard against the captain's helmet. The iron dented, and the traitor dropped to his knees. John pressed the tip of his blade against the man's throat. "Tell the usurpers that retribution is coming for them," John commanded. He struck the captain senseless with a swift blow to the jaw. The village square fell into a heavy silence. Only the crackling flames dared to make a sound. John lowered his sword, his broad chest rising and falling evenly. He did not even glance at the awestruck villagers. He turned his back on the conquered enemy and walked toward the woods. The lethal predator vanished instantly, replaced by an anxious protector. Mary stepped out from behind the snow-covered boulder. She stared at the bodies scattered across the mud. She had never witnessed such raw violence. John stopped a few paces away from her. He suddenly felt hyper-aware of the blood staining his knuckles. He dropped the stolen sword into the snow. Mary looked past the carnage and met his dark eyes. She did not shrink away from his massive frame. She walked forward and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. John let out a long breath and buried his face in her shoulder. He wrapped his large arms around her fragile form, shielding her from the smoke. The old man from the village slowly approached the edge of the woods. He recognized the ragged shawl Mary wore. "Mary?" the elder asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. John lifted his head, his eyes hardening into dark obsidian. He stepped slightly in front of Mary, blocking the villager's view. "Address her with respect," John warned in a dangerous tone. The elder fell to his knees in the snow, bowing his head. Other villagers followed suit, dropping into the cold slush. They bowed not to the fearsome king, but to the orphan they had despised. Mary watched the scene from the safety of John's shadow. She realized her life of starvation was truly over. The freezing mud of the village square absorbed the spilled blood of the traitors. John stood like a dark monolith before the kneeling villagers. Mary remained tucked safely behind his broad shoulder. The old village elder kept his forehead pressed against the slush. "Forgive our ignorance, my lord," the elder stammered. "We did not know that true sovereign walked among us." John looked at the groveling crowd with immense disgust. "You bow to a king because you fear his sword," John said coldly. "Yet you cast an orphan into the snow because she had none." He turned his attention back to the burning remains of the captain's supply cart. 2 heavy war horses stood tethered to a wooden post near the flames. The beasts stamped their iron-shod hooves in the dirty snow. John walked forward and caught the thick leather reins. He quieted the panicking horses with a firm, steady hand. Several villagers scrambled to gather intact sacks of grain and salted meat. They brought the supplies forward and placed them hesitantly near his boots. "A tribute for the king," a woman offered with a trembling voice. John ignored the woman completely and looked back at Mary. "They offer this to you, Mary," he told her, loudly enough for all to hear. Mary stepped forward and looked at the faces of her former tormentors. She recognized the baker who had once beaten her for dropping a loaf of bread. She saw the blacksmith who had laughed when her thin boots fell apart in the rain. They avoided her eyes, their expressions heavy with sudden shame. Mary felt a strange calm wash over her fragile frame. She did not feel any desire for petty vengeance. "We will take only what we need to survive the journey," Mary decided. John nodded once, accepting her judgment without question. He began loading the heavy sacks of food onto the larger black horse. He secured thick wool blankets and fresh leather cloaks over the saddlebags. The elder raised his head, watching the preparations with fearful eyes. "Where will you go, Mary?" the old man dared to ask. John stopped tying the leather straps and turned his dark gaze upon the elder. "She goes to a throne," John declared, with absolute certainty. A collective gasp leapt through the kneeling crowd. "The usurpers took my crown in the dead of night," John continued. "I will return in the light of day and wash the capital in their blood." He walked over to Mary and draped a heavy fur-lined cloak around her shoulders. The thick material swallowed her small frame entirely. He fastened the iron clasp beneath her chin with surprising gentleness. "No cold will ever touch you again," John promised quietly. Mary looked up at him, her brown eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out and placed a small hand against his solid chest. "I do not need a throne, John," she whispered. "You deserve the world," he replied simply, "and I intend to give it to you." John led the second horse forward and checked the leather stirrups. The mount was a massive war horse, bred for armored combat. Mary stared at the towering beast with clear apprehension. She had never ridden an animal in her entire life. John noticed her hesitation and offered a reassuring smile. He stepped behind her and gripped her waist with his large hands. He lifted her effortlessly into the air as if she weighed nothing at all. Mary let out a soft gasp as she settled onto the wide leather saddle. John adjusted the heavy cloaks around her legs to block the biting wind. He handed her the thick leather reins and showed her how to hold them. "Hold these gently, and he will follow my lead," John instructed. He swung himself onto the black horse with fluid, practiced grace. The movement caused a brief stab of pain in his healing side, but he ignored it. He steered his massive mount to the head of the snowy path. He did not cast a single backward glance at the ruined village. The people there belonged to a past Mary would never revisit. Mary urged her horse forward and followed closely behind him. The snow crunched heavily beneath the iron hooves of the horses. They left the smoking valley and entered the deep, ancient forest. The winter woods closed around them like a protective cathedral. The wind howled through the high branches, but the thick trees broke its force. Mary pulled the fur collar up against her face, relishing the unfamiliar warmth. Her stomach was full of salted meat, and her future was suddenly vast. She watched John's broad back sway in rhythm with his horse's stride. He looked like a dark conqueror riding through the frozen wilderness. Yet he constantly slowed his pace to ensure she was not falling behind. Hours passed as they navigated the treacherous mountain passes. The gray sky began to darken into a bruised purple twilight. John signaled a halt near a shallow cave set beneath a rocky overhang. He dismounted quickly and walked over to help Mary down. Her legs felt numb and stiff from the long ride in the saddle. When she slid down, her knees buckled upon hitting the frozen ground. John caught her instantly, pulling her against his chest to steady her. "The first ride is always the hardest," he said softly. Mary leaned against him for a moment, absorbing his steady strength. "I am fine," she insisted, stepping back with a small smile. John tied the horses to a sturdy pine tree and brought the supplies inside the cave. He gathered dry branches and started a small, crackling fire near the entrance. The orange light pushed back the creeping shadows of the night. They sat together on the spread blankets, sharing a quiet meal. The silent bond between them felt stronger than forged steel. Mary watched the flames dance across the rugged lines of his face. The harsh scar on his jaw looked less menacing in the warm light. "How far is the capital?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. 2 weeks of hard riding toward the southern plains," John answered. He tossed another dry branch onto the fire, sending sparks into the air. "My enemies will be waiting behind high stone walls." "Will your remaining loyal men join you?" Mary wondered aloud. "I do not know who remains loyal," John admitted frankly. "Treason spreads like a plague when a king falls." He looked at his hands, remembering the blood he had spilled that morning. "I must assume every man with a sword is an enemy until proven otherwise." Mary reached across the blankets and covered his large hand with her own. "You will not be fighting alone this time," she told him firmly. John stared at her small fingers resting against his rough skin. Her presence anchored his dark soul to the light. "I will keep you far from the battlefield," he promised her. "I will not hide while you risk your life," Mary countered immediately. "You are my protector, but I am not a fragile glass doll." John smiled, a rare expression that completely transformed his stern face. He recognized the stubborn fire burning in her brown eyes. It was the same fire that had kept her alive in the freezing borderlands. "I know you are not fragile, Mary," he said. "You saved a dying man when you had nothing to give. That requires more strength than swinging a steel sword." The winter night deepened around their small sanctuary. John laid his heavy sword near his side and closed his eyes. He remained half awake, listening to the wind and the breathing of the horses. Mary curled up under the thick fur blankets and watched him. She felt completely safe in the company of the most dangerous man alive. She knew the road ahead would be paved with blood and retribution. But as long as he was beside her, she would walk it without fear. The journey southward tested their endurance against the biting winter. For 8 days, the snow-covered landscape offered no comfort. The wind howled relentlessly across the barren ridges. Ice clung to the thick manes of their war horses. John guided their heavy mounts through deep drifts and treacherous ravines. He always positioned his massive horse to break the freezing wind for Mary. They shared their meals in silence beneath the heavy canopy of ancient pines. John wrapped an extra wool blanket around Mary every morning. He checked her boots for frostbite during every brief halt. Mary noticed he always took the smaller portion of their rations. She began to secretly hide dried meat in her pockets to share with him later. When he discovered her deception, he offered a rare, genuine laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound that warmed the freezing air. "You cannot trick a soldier with his own supplies, Mary," he had told her. Yet he ate the extra food she offered, unable to refuse her sincere care. Mary learned to endure the long hours in the leather saddle without complaint. Her body grew accustomed to the swaying rhythm of the warhorse. During their brief rests, John did not force her to stay idle. He remembered her vow in the cave to never be a helpless victim. On the 9th afternoon, John handed her a thick wooden branch. He had stripped the bark, smoothed the edges with his knife. Mary took the makeshift weapon, looking at him with curious eyes. "You must know how to protect yourself if we are separated," John explained. He stood a few paces away and adopted a relaxed stance.
"Strike my chest," he instructed calmly. Mary hesitated, gripping the heavy wood with both hands. She swung the branch awkwardly toward his torso. John deflected the blow effortlessly with his bare forearm. He stepped forward and corrected her grip, placing his large hands over her fingers. His touch was patient and incredibly precise. "Do not rely on your arms," John told her. "Drive the force from your legs and turn your hips." Mary nodded, absorbing his tactical instructions with serious focus. They practiced these basic defensive strikes every evening before building their fire. Mary stumbled and dropped the branch countless times in the snow. John never displayed frustration or impatience. He simply picked up the wood and handed it back to her. He respected her determination far more than raw physical strength. On the 10th day, they rested near a frozen stream. John handed her the smoothed branch again. "Defend yourself," he instructed, moving toward her with measured steps. He swung his open hand slowly toward her shoulder. Mary planted her feet firmly in the snow and raised the wood. She twisted her hips exactly as he had taught her. The wooden branch met his forearm with a loud, solid crack. John stopped his movement, genuinely impressed by the force of her block. "Good," he praised her, his dark eyes shining with pride. "Never close your eyes when you strike." Mary nodded, feeling a new surge of confidence in her chest. She was no longer the frightened girl starving in a ruined hut. His belief in her was forging an entirely new strength within her soul. The lessons built a profound, unspoken trust between them. On the 12th morning, the terrain shifted dramatically. The dense forests gave way to a vast expanse of jagged black rock. "Blackstone Gorge," John announced, pulling back on his leather reins. The narrow pass cut through the towering mountains like a deep wound. It was the only viable route to the southern plains and the capital. John dismounted and knelt to examine the hard earth. Mary waited quietly, trusting his sharp instincts. "A large group passed through here recently," John noted, brushing away the loose snow. "Heavy boots and iron-shod horses." He stood up and surveyed the narrow entrance to the gorge. "Mercenaries hired by the usurpers," he concluded grimly. "They are holding the pass to intercept any loyalist reinforcements." Mary tightened her grip on her reins. "Can we go around them?" she asked, looking at the steep cliffs. "The mountains are impassable in winter," John replied. He walked over to her horse and placed a hand on its warm neck. "We must go through them, Mary." He led her horse away from the main path, toward a steep, rocky incline. They climbed the difficult terrain until they reached a secluded plateau. The high vantage point offered a clear view of the gorge below. A crude barricade of spiked logs blocked the narrowest point of the pass. 24 armed men guarded the makeshift gate. They warmed their hands over iron braziers, completely unaware of the danger above. "Stay here," John commanded, handing her the reins of his black horse. "Keep the animals quiet and stay out of sight." Mary looked down at the overwhelming number of enemy soldiers. "They are too many, John," she whispered, a trace of fear returning to her voice. John touched her cheek gently, calming her immediate panic. "They are undisciplined thugs," he assured her. "I will use the canyon against them." He drew his stolen longsword and turned away from the plateau. Mary watched him descend the rocky slope with lethal silence. He did not march openly down the center of the road. He moved like a dark shadow among the jagged boulders. John understood that absolute power required tactical brilliance, not just brute force. He reached the floor of the gorge completely unseen. He picked up a heavy stone and hurled it across the canyon. The rock shattered loudly against the far cliff wall. 5 mercenaries drew their weapons and rushed toward the sudden noise. John waited until they were separated from the main group. He stepped out from behind a large stalagmite and engaged them. His first strike severed a spear shaft in half and crushed the attacker's collarbone. He ducked a wild sword swing and drove his pommel into the second man's temple. The encounter was devastatingly brief. The remaining 3 men panicked and tried to shout an alarm. John silenced them with swift, clinical strikes that ended their resistance instantly. He did not revel in the violence, but he executed it with terrifying efficiency. The captain of the mercenaries finally noticed the missing patrol. "To arms," the captain yelled, drawing a heavy battle axe. The rest of the camp scrambled to form a defensive line. John stepped into the open path, his sword resting easily at his side. He faced the charging mob with an unnerving calm. He waited for them to funnel into the narrowest section of the stone pass. Their numbers meant nothing in the restricted space. They could only attack him 1 or 2 at a time. John met the first wave with crushing force. He parried a heavy axe blow and disarmed the attacker with a sharp twist. He used the momentum to drive his elbow into the next man's chest. Weapons clashed against the stone walls, creating a deafening echo. John fought with a rhythmic, mechanical perfection. He anticipated their uncoordinated strikes before they even launched them. He broke their weapons and shattered their armor. The ground became slick with melted snow and defeat. The mercenary captain swung his battle axe in a desperate, wide arc. John stepped inside the guard and struck the man's wrist. The heavy axe fell uselessly to the dirt. John delivered a devastating kick to the captain's chest, sending him crashing into the barricade. The remaining mercenaries dropped their weapons and fled down the gorge. John did not pursue the broken men. His message would spread faster on the lips of cowards. He wiped his blade on a discarded cloak and sheathed the weapon. The silence returned quickly to the icy gorge. John inspected the abandoned mercenary camp for usable supplies. He found a small chest of silver coins and 2 fresh canteens of water. He secured the items in his saddlebags before returning to the rocky incline. The path to the southern plains was now entirely open. He walked over to the barricade and easily dismantled the spiked logs. Mary watched the entire battle from her hidden plateau. She remained absolutely stunned by his martial dominance. He had dismantled an entire mercenary company without suffering a single scratch. John climbed back up the steep incline and approached her. His breathing was completely steady. He took the reins of his black horse from her hands. "The pass is clear," John announced quietly. Mary looked at his face, seeing the gentle protector returning to the surface. "You are unhurt," she said, letting out a long breath of relief. "I promise to keep you safe, Mary," John replied. He mounted his massive horse and signaled her to follow. They rode down the cleared path and passed through the broken barricade. The harsh mountains slowly fell behind them. The vast, snow-covered plains of the southern kingdom stretched out before their eyes. The temperature felt slightly warmer as they descended from the high altitude. Patches of dead brown grass poked through the melting snow. Far in the distance, a massive stone structure loomed against the horizon. It was the great fortress of the capital, surrounded by high walls. John stared at his stolen home, his jaw tightening into a hard line. The final battle for his throne was finally approaching. The southern plains stretched out beneath a heavy, unforgiving sky. The massive stone walls of the capital rose like a malevolent shadow against the horizon. John halted their war horses near a ruined stone farmhouse on the desolate outskirts of the city. He helped Mary dismount and led her carefully into the hidden, overgrown courtyard. They tied the exhausted horses to a sturdy iron ring and moved inside the abandoned structure. Mary peered through a shattered window toward the towering fortress. Black banners of the usurper flapped violently in the freezing morning wind. John stood closely behind her,
his dark eyes analyzing the heavy fortifications with clinical precision. "My brother commands thousands of men behind those ancient walls," John stated quietly. Mary turned to face him, her brow furrowing with deep concern. "We cannot fight an entire army alone," Mary whispered. John offered her a small, confident smile that arrested the grim lines of his face. "A true sovereign never relies entirely on a visible army," he explained. He reached into his leather tunic and pulled out a heavy iron signet ring. The dark metal was forged in the shape of a snarling wolf. "Before I left the capital, I established a Vamber of Shadows," John said. "They are men who swore an oath to my blood, not to the throne." He walked toward the cold hearth and began gathering broken chair legs for a fire. "They wait for a signal that their king has returned from the abyss," he added. Mary watched him work, deeply amazed by the terrifying depth of his strategic mind. He had anticipated treason long before the cowardly dagger ever struck his back. The small fire sparked to life, offering a meager defense against the damp chill of the ruins. They sat together on the dusty floor, sharing their remaining rations of hard bread and dried meat. The impending battle hung over them like a suspended blade in the quiet room. Yet Mary felt absolutely no panic in the presence of his unshakable certainty. "What is the signal?" Mary asked, pulling her heavy fur cloak tight around her shoulders. "At midnight I will light a watchfire on the eastern ridge," John answered. "If my loyalists still draw breath, they will open the iron gates at dawn." He looked at the iron ring in his hand, his expression growing dark and unreadable. "And if they are gone," Mary pressed gently. "Then I will breach the gates myself," John replied without hesitation. He set the ring down and shifted his broad frame closer to her. The flickering firelight cast a warm, dancing glow across her tired but beautiful face. John reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I spent my entire life believing that Stone Castle was my only sanctuary," John confessed. He looked deeply into her brown eyes, laying his guarded soul completely bare. "I was surrounded by gold and silk, but I was freezing to death." Mary placed her small, calloused hand over his heavily scarred knuckles. "You found warmth in a broken hut," Mary reminded him softly. "I found you," John corrected, his voice dropping to a rough, emotional whisper. "You gave me the strength to survive the winter." He leaned forward and rested his forehead gently against hers. "When I reclaim this city, you will never know hunger or fear again." Mary closed her eyes, absorbing the profound weight of his solemn vow. She did not care about the gold or the power he promised to lay at her feet. She only cared about the man who had carved a wooden comb for a starving orphan. Midnight approached with a freezing, silent dread that gripped the plains. John left the farmhouse and climbed the steep eastern ridge alone in the darkness. He gathered dry brush and struck a flint to ignite a massive, roaring blaze. The flames leaped into the dark sky, serving as a burning beacon of undeniable retribution. He stood before the fire for a long moment, letting the usurpers see his blatant defiance. He returned to the farmhouse and sat vigil beside Mary until the horizon turned pale. Dawn broke over the capital, casting a cold blue light across the frost-covered grass. John and Mary mounted their war horses and rode openly toward the main stone road. They did not attempt to hide their approach from the towering watchtowers. Horn blasts echoed across the stone walls, signaling the arrival of an unknown enemy. Archers appeared quickly along the high battlements, raising their heavy wooden bows. Mary held her breath, her hands gripping the thick leather reins tightly. John rode forward with a terrifying, majestic calm that defied the aimed weapons. He did not draw his sword or raise his shield to protect himself. He simply stared at the massive iron gates with the authority of a rightful god.
Suddenly, shouts of violent chaos erupted from behind the heavy stone walls.
The sharp sound of clashing steel and dying men drifted over the high battlements. The archers on the wall rapidly lowered their weapons and turned to fight an unseen enemy. John stopped his horse 50 yards from the entrance and waited in total silence. The massive iron gears of the gatehouse began to groan and turn with a deafening screech. The heavy iron doors swung inward, revealing a courtyard drenched in fresh conflict. A dozen men in black armor stood victorious over the broken bodies of the usurper's guards. The leader of the black-clad soldiers stepped forward and dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. "The vanguard holds the gates, my king," the loyalist announced loudly. John nodded once, accepting their fierce fealty with a solemn grace. "Secure the perimeter and open the path to the throne room," John commanded. He turned to Mary, who was watching the incredible scene with wide, astonished eyes. "Stay close to me," John instructed, his voice cutting clearly through the distant sounds of battle. They rode slowly through the iron gates, entering the wealthy heart of the capital city. The citizens of the city cowered in their tall stone homes, peering fearfully through shuttered windows. They expected to see a massive, conquering army marching through their cobblestone streets. Instead, they saw only 2 solitary riders. They saw their legendary sovereign returning from the realm of the dead. And they saw a fragile woman, draped in heavy furs, riding proudly by his side. A squad of traitorous soldiers rushed down the main avenue in a desperate attempt to intercept them. John did not wait for his vanguard to engage the approaching threat. He spurred his black warhorse forward, drawing his long sword in a single, fluid motion. The enemy soldiers raised their shields, expecting a standard cavalry charge. John struck their defensive line with the unstoppable force of a falling meteor. His sword cleaved through wood and iron armor with devastating, lethal precision. He dismantled the entire squad in a matter of seconds, leaving a wide trail of defeated men. He fought with a brutal elegance, ensuring not a single drop of blood splattered onto Mary's fur cloak. The psychological crush on the remaining traitors observing from the alleys was absolute. Men dropped their weapons and fled in terror, completely broken by his lethal prowess. John guided his horse through the chaotic streets, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the central keep. His treacherous brother waited inside that heavily fortified stone tower. The time for mercy had ended weeks ago in the freezing snow of the borderlands. The time for absolute payback had finally arrived. Mary rode faithfully behind him, bearing witness to his dark majesty. She knew the man wielding the bloody sword was not a monster. He was simply clearing the debris to build a beautiful, safe world for her.
You know, this story really got to me. It just goes to show that even the hardest hearts can be saved by a single, quiet act of kindness. How did Mary and John's journey make you feel? Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from today. If you loved this, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.